So, so the peoples of the colonies always resisted, of course, and that resistance often forced concessions out of the colonial rulers. But the monopoly on the most high-tech advanced weaponry held by the colonial powers meant that however heroic this resistance was, it was rarely able to actually overthrow European rule. However, that changed after the Second World War. The exploitation of the colonies was stepped up during the war as the European powers took everything they could from the colonies to help with the war effort. So in India, for example, this caused a famine that killed between 1.5 and 3 million people. And this exploitation led to massive support for the growing political movements calling for independence and an end to colonial rule. But the war did not only that, it also taught the people how to fight and armed them. So hundreds of thousands of soldiers across Africa and India and Britain, France's other other colonies were recruited from the colonies, and then they returned home ready to fight for their freedom. And at the same time, the Soviet Union had emerged from the war as a military superpower. And as communists, the Soviets had always been against colonialism, and now they began actually themselves sending arms to the political movements that were fighting for freedom across Africa and Asia. Now, eventually the colonial powers gave in. One by one, they granted political independence to the territories they had once controlled. They were no longer able to keep control of those territories in a profitable way, given the amount of armed uprisings and resistance and so on against them. But of course, they tried to manage that transition to independence in such a way that as far as possible continue to maintain that flow of wealth and resources from south to north. So this is where we enter the period of neocolonialism. Now, it was Kwame Nkrumah who led the fight against British colonialism in Ghana, who originally coined the term neocolonialism. And he said, quote, "The essence of neocolonialism is the state which is subject to it is in theory independent and has all the outward trappings of international sovereignty, but in reality its economic system is directed from outside." So in other words, he was saying neocolonialism combines formal political independence with continued economic dependence and exploitation. He added that, quote, "The economic object of neocolonialism, the point of it, is to keep living standards depressed in the interests of the developed countries." He also said it was to preserve, quote, "the colonial pattern of commerce and industry." So in other words, neocolonialism is all about maintaining that division of labour that colonialism established between the core countries of the global north with the developed high-tech industries and the periphery whose role was supposed to be to provide cheap raw materials and cheap labour for the industries of the north. So the question is, how does neocolonialism maintain this division? And I would argue there's 5 main ways actually. So first of all is the activities of TNCs, transnational corporations. Nkrumah argued the continued foreign ownership of land and resources in formerly colonized countries was one of the chief forms of neocolonial exploitation. Modern day opponents of transnational corporations point out that these TNCs, the vast majority of which are based in the US and Western Europe, remember 97 of the world's wealthiest 100 corporations, TNCs, are from the global north. And what they do is they take advantage of cheap labour whilst getting away with highly damaging environmental practices which would not be tolerated in their home countries. And this environmental damage can lead directly to poverty as farmers' livelihoods are ruined by pollution. And we've looked at examples of Shell Oil in Nigeria, Anglo Gold Ashanti, gold mining in Ghana, Coca-Cola factories in India, so on and so forth. And the profits of these TNCs, generated by the backbreaking work of Africans in mines and Asians in sweatshops, accrues entirely to their European and American shareholders. So that's a big transfer of wealth from south to north. The labour that's going on in the global south, in the mines and plantations and factories in the global south, is producing wealth that is then going to the global north, the owners of those industries. A second way to maintain that division and maintain that flow of resources from south to north is through debt. Now, when the countries of the global south gained their political independence from mainly between the 1940s and 1960s, They were obviously impoverished and underdeveloped following decades and sometimes centuries of highly destructive colonial rule. So in order to develop, they borrowed money from Western financial institutions like the World Bank and others like private banks. However, these debts began to become unpayable in the 1980s as the US government raised interest rates to, I think, nearly 30%, which led to a doubling of debt owed approximately every 3 years. So by the mid-2000s, the flow of interest payments from poor Global South countries to wealthy financial institutions in the Global North had reached tens of billions of dollars every year and was estimated actually at 13 times the amount of aid given from North to South. So for every dollar of aid given by the North to the South, they were paying back 13 times that amount in interest payments on those debts that they had. Now this represented a massive flow of wealth from South to North, and to make things worse, the loans had often not been used to build infrastructure as they were supposedly intended for, but had actually been stolen often by corrupt dictators, leaving the population with huge debts to pay for development that had never actually happened. And worse still, these dictators were often put into power by the former colonial powers in the first place. So if I give you the example of the Congo, which is a former Belgian colony in Africa. Now, the Congolese elected for their first elections following independence in 1961. They elected a socialist president, Patrice Lumumba. Now, Lumumba wanted to nationalize the old Belgian-owned colonial industries in order to achieve genuine economic independence for his country. Now, obviously, the Belgians didn't want this, so they, along with Britain and the US, conspired to help organize a military coup against Lumumba. So Lumumba was killed and replaced by a military dictator, Mobutu, who went on to rack up $14 billion worth of debt by the time he was overthrown in 1997. Now, most of this money he borrowed was not used to develop the Congo, but was simply stolen by him and his family. So this means the Congolese people today are still paying off a debt racked up by someone they never elected to finance development which never happened. And they're paying this debt to the very governments of the Global North that put Mobutu into power in the first place. So this gives a very clear idea of what we mean by neocolonialism, as the flow of resources from south to north established by colonialism continues as before, despite formal political independence. A third mechanism by which this transfer of resources takes place under neocolonialism is through unfair trade. So the debt crisis I mentioned earlier from the 1980s onwards gave an enormous amount of power to those international lending institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank, who then agreed to reschedule the debts of Global South countries, that's reduce the payments or make the payment time a bit longer, only if those countries accepted their structural adjustment programs, as we saw in topic 4. So this meant Global South governments had to end their protectionist policies, such as subsidies to their farmers or tariffs to protect their infant industries, and instead had to open their doors to foreign investment and competition and imports and so on. And the result in many cases was the bankrupting of domestic industry under pressure from foreign imports and a resulting increase in poverty. In a similar way, even aid has actually been used as a weapon against poor countries. So Johan Norberg, in his documentary Globalization is Good, has shown how countries such as Kenya were subjected in the 1980s to so-called food dumping, whereby deliveries of wheat meant that domestic wheat growers were then put out of business. Now, this process of forcing poor countries to open up to cheap imports and preventing them from supporting their own industries and farmers is particularly unfair, as the Global North does not apply these policies to themselves. So the EU gives billions of euros in subsidies to its own farmers every year, for example, as does the US. And this means that the Global South has even less chance of competing against Global North products. So the whole trade system is very unfair. And that's another transfer of resources through the unfair terms of trade. Fourthly, is the system of tax havens established by the Global North. So Britain didn't actually completely decolonize. There's still some islands all around the world that were colonized by Britain that are still controlled directly by Britain today. So Britain actually hung on to a string of these island colonies around the world, places like the British Virgin Islands, the Cayman Islands, Bermuda, and so on. It's about 14 or 15 of them. And it converted them into tax havens places where people could deposit their money in banks without having to pay any tax, any income tax or corporation tax, completely secretly, and this is the key, without any questions being asked. So this was where these new corrupt elites that were installed in power by countries like Britain could then hide the money they stole from the people. So Mobutu and all of these other kind of characters would hide their money in these tax havens, and other criminals and so on could do the same. And it's very difficult for the legitimate tax authorities of those countries to actually trace the money because of the secrecy employed in the tax havens. And the banks based there would then transfer their money to their parent companies in the City of London. So, and it's illegal transfers of money out of developing countries are estimated today at $1.25 trillion a year, almost all of which are processed in tax havens before then being transferred to the financial centres of London and New York. So between them, these four mechanisms of transferring wealth from south to north, the activities of TNCs, the extortionate debt repayments, unfair trade practices and tax havens add up to around $3 trillion per year being transferred from the poorest countries to the richest. This is according to a group called Global Financial Integrity. Now, this amount, $3 trillion, is around 24 times the total amount of aid given by rich countries to poor countries. So in other words, for each dollar in aid given to the south by the north, around $24 is taken back through these various mechanisms just described. So this is precisely what we mean by neocolonialism. It's the continued transfer of wealth from the global south to the global north, from the former colonies, that is, to the old colonial powers. And this is the kind of analysis put forward by what are called dependency theorists, advocates of dependency theory. Now, dependency theorists highlight this global division of labour between what they term the core of the global economy, the wealthy, high-tech, advanced economies of the global north, and what they term the periphery, the underdeveloped, more impoverished countries of the global south. And they argue that this division leaves the south dependent on the north, dependent for export markets, for investment, and so on, which gives the north leverage over the south, gives them power over the south, enabling them to continue their extraction of wealth through all the methods we just looked at. So the question is, why does the south allow this, right? Why does it not challenge this neo-colonial relationship and say enough? Well, the answer then is in the